is abortion, but in particular, the history of abortion. New book out by Crossway Books, which is entitled The Story of Abortion in America, A Street-Level History from 1652 to 2022. It is written by our good friend Dr. Marvin Olasky and Leah Savas, and she joins us. By the way, let me just mention the foreword by Robert George, and again, some great material, endorsements by all sorts of individuals that have been on this program, like Kristen Hawkins, as well as Thomas Kidd and Frederica Matthews Green, and many, many others. And so again, Leah is an individual that is a co-author of this book. She also reports on the subject of abortion for the World News Group. She writes a weekly Vitals Roundup and newsletter on pro-life news and joins us now by phone. So thank you for joining us today.
Thanks for having me, Kerby.
Let's, if we can, talk about the origin of the book first. And again, you have written the latter part, which we'll probably spend most of our time on in terms of the more recent history, but we'll give at least some coverage of the history leading up to the middle of the 21st century, the 20th century, I should say. But you and Marvin Olasky wrote this book really in the anticipation, as I understand, of the 50th anniversary of Roe versus Wade, which, of course, took place January 22nd, 2023. But then, of course, the decision, the Dobbs decision, sort of changed everything. But this was an idea to really give people a sense of history and context for the issue of abortion. Can you give us some of the background?
Yeah, so Marvin Olasky, my co-author, it was originally his idea to rewrite or update, I guess, a book that he put out in the 90s called Abortion Rights. Mm-hmm. But then as he was kind of doing research and looking at archives that are available online, he realized that because of the internet, largely there's just a lot more information available today than there was when he wrote Abortion Rights. So that's when he realized, okay, I can't just do an update. I'm going to do a brand new book. And he asked me to come on board to help him with that, to write the last few chapters, kind of updating the things that have happened since abortion rights came out. But we also worked together, just kind of doing his chapters that he wrote. I got to edit some of those and give him feedback on that as well. But so he covers the period from 1652 until the 90s. The reason why we start in 1652 is because we're looking specifically at the first recorded and confirmed abortion in America, which was in 1652, which I think surprises a lot of people. When I say that I helped write a book about the history of abortion in America, I think a lot of people assume that would start with the Roe v. Wade decision in the 1970s. But no, you can go all the way back to the 1650s, and there you have cases of abortion. So in the book, we're trying to kind of address some of the misconceptions about abortion in America. And many of those are from the Roe v. Wade decision, such as the assertion that abortion was seen as acceptable up until quickening, or about 5 months in early America. But we look at these early records to see, what did people actually think about abortion in colonial America. So that's kind of what we do in this book.
Well, you were anticipating my next question. Of course, you've already started answering it, and that is, I know enough, and of course, I've known Marvin Olasky for decades, but I do know that one of the reasons he wrote that first book, and one of the reasons why he's really stayed on this, is just the incredible amount of misinformation, and you mentioned just one example of the fact that really abortion was pretty much acceptable. It wasn't a big issue, and this is something that the Christian right began to latch onto after the 1973 Roe versus Wade decision, which is, of course, not true. And anybody that has any doubt about that simply digs into this book. And I know that was one of the reasons he wrote the first book. I know that's why you've written the second one as well. And I also was struck by the fact that in addition to kind of a who's who of people that have endorsed the book, you also were able to have Robert George, who, of course, is that very well-known and prestigious professor at Princeton, to write your forward, because this is a story that needs to be told. And even in the Dobbs decision, as you point out early on in the book, Justice Alito, Samuel Alito, wrote some of the legal history of abortion, but this really is a perfect companion that gives the historical version and historical facts about abortion as well, doesn't it?
Yeah, and that's kind of the story, I guess, behind the title, The Story of Abortion in America, A Street Level History. So we don't want to take the view of, obviously there's a place for legal scholars, for more high-level academic work, and we would refer to that as maybe more suite level. If you think of like someone in a suite of a building, up a few floors, looking down at the street. They're a distance away from the actual street where people are walking. So when we talk about street level history, we're talking about, what are the day-to-day decisions of people? Let's go deeper than just the ideas. Let's look at the repercussions of those ideas, how they play out in someone's life. And that's where we get kind of that street level idea. And that's why we focus on a lot of individuals. We try to tell their stories, help the readers get to know them as people. Tell the story of abortion in America in that way by telling the stories of people who have been affected by abortion, whether willingly or unwillingly.
Again, I might just mention your first chapter is street level versus suite level, if you can see that distinction. But let's, if we can, briefly talk about some of these previous years. But that first section was unsafe, illegal, and rare, which is a play on words because many might remember that President Bill Clinton used to say that he wanted abortion to be safe, legal, and rare. But back in 1652, with that first abortion, it was unsafe, it was illegal, and it was rare, wasn't it?
Yes. And so that story, that first abortion that we talk about in the book, is the story of a man named Captain William Mitchell who came over from England with servants, one of them being Susan Warren. And eventually she became pregnant by him. He did not want that child and forced an abortifacient on her in a poached egg. So that's the story of the first recorded abortion in America. She did not die, but the baby died. And Captain Mitchell, eventually he went on trial for murder, actually. Fast forward, and another man, kind of in the same time period as Captain Mitchell, he knew Captain Mitchell, his name was Francis Brooks. He also impregnated a woman and forced an abortifacient on her, and he also went on trial for murder. And in that story specifically, we get a really key detail from the historical records, the detail being that a midwife, Rose Smith, saw the aborted baby in this case and confirmed in testimony that the baby was 3 months old. So that is 2 months before quickening, which is the point at which, in the Roe v. Wade decision, it's asserted that up until quickening abortion was acceptable. Well, this is 2 months before that. So how could that be acceptable by the community if they put him on trial for murder?
And Leah, of course, when we go through this quickly, I don't want to skip one thing where you were talking about the midwives, and that shows, again, another one of those misconceptions, because we're always told that really the first American law against abortion actually was in Connecticut in 1821. But if you go back and look at the fact that you had a council that actually prohibited midwives from aiding in or recommending abortion, that was in 1716, which, if our numbers are right, 105 years earlier. So just as you a minute ago were mentioning a midwife, this oath for midwives, which is early on, illustrates again one of the misconceptions, dare I even use the word misinformation, about this issue of abortion.
Yeah, it's so interesting kind of looking in these historical records and seeing how midwives actually treated the abortion issue. That's a great example there, the oath that midwives had to take when it came to abortion. It just shows kind of the general feel of early American communities when it comes to the abortion issue. It wasn't seen as something acceptable. even as early as this oath, we have these examples of communities pushing back, trying to find ways to limit abortion. There's also other examples of how communities came around women facing unplanned pregnancies, such as one rule for that midwives were supposed to follow, which was if we don't know who the father of this child is, if there's no lead on who the dad is, who should be kind of taking financial responsibility for this child, then the midwives were told to ask women while they were giving birth, in the act of labor, who's the dad? And whoever she said was considered to be the father by law. And that was one way that they tried to push back against, abortion as being a solution, but also making sure that no child went without support, that no single mother went without support as well. So yeah, just seeing these communities come around women in these difficult cases, it should be a really great example to us today, where we've largely seen a breakdown of that community.
Well, again, if we illustrate why this was sort of unthinkable. First of all, you have individuals that had a Christian perspective, by and large, or even Jewish individuals that might have as well. So you had Catholic, Protestant, Jews, especially during, as we would talk about, the 19th century. Children were not seen as a liability. They were seen as an asset. Having as many children as you could, if you're working in a farm community, were more hands to bring in the harvest. So there was certainly this kind of rejection of the idea of killing anyway, and there was certainly a tremendous benefit. And as you pointed out, some of the examples of when abortions were taking place is when there was immorality. But you had, even during the 19th century, what was called a Committee on Criminal Abortion. And so you had that started by the American Medical Association. Maybe hard for people to understand that today, but during the 19th century, there was a real belief that this should be something that should not be done. It's something that should be punished, and something that was initiated by the American Medical Association.
Yeah, and that's a really interesting tie into the whole question of when life begins. And, today you'll hear people say that there's no consensus about when life begins. Even the Dobbs decision that overturned Roe v. Wade doesn't really address that question. The Roe v. Wade decision from the 1970s treats the abortion issue as if there has been a consensus or a lack of consensus on when life begins. When in reality, if you look at the historical records, as Marvin does in these early chapters, you can see that there seemed to be an understanding among many doctors that life does begin at conception. Even as far back as the 1830s, there were doctors giving lectures on the fact that, when you're an obstetrician gynecologist, when you are treating a pregnant woman, you actually have two patients that you're caring for. Mm-hmm. And this is the language that we're hearing from doctors, like I said, in the 1830s. And so that's why a lot of doctors began pushing the American Medical Association to push back against abortion, and that had an effect on states, and they increased their penalties for people who would participate in abortion. So yeah, that push was largely led by doctors. Some people will say it's because they wanted to take the business away from midwives, but you can't ignore that it was a very strong pro-life conviction that they had, that was fed by their understanding of science, that made them see that life begins at conception and that unborn babies are humans. They're not just a clump of cells. They are distinct individuals from the moment of fertilization.
Some people might say, well, when did that change? And you have a chapter again that Marvin Olasky wrote, The Father of Abortion Rights, Lawrence Ladder. And it does seem to me that Later, I guess is how he's pronounced his name, is an individual that really began that. Of course, you have all sorts of other things. You have Planned Parenthood and the rest. But by the time you get into the 20th century, everything from Margaret Sanger, eugenics movement, Lawrence later, and all the others, you now have this emphasis that abortion is a positive and abortion rights need to be emphasized. And so that really was a major turn, wasn't it?
Yeah, for doctors, even in the 1800s, as I was talking about before, they understood that this knowledge that they had wasn't necessarily widely held. It's not like everyday people knew the science of unborn life. So doctors often saw it as their responsibility to inform women of what's actually going on when they're pregnant, what they would be doing if they were getting an abortion. But it's hard to kind of spread that information without the aid of visuals. So that's why today, now with the ultrasound technology that's really sprung up since the late 1900s, today we just have a strong advantage over these early pro-life doctors. We are able to show what they couldn't show in the same way. And yet it's interesting, like you're saying, like seeing this spread of an understanding of abortion being a good thing, of abortion being a positive thing. And in the book, we talk about how the argument for the pro-abortion side is women's rights, or, considering the woman who is facing this difficult pregnancy. And I think sometimes it's easier for people to visualize a woman facing the difficulties of pregnancy on her own than it is to visualize, a very underdeveloped human in the womb who, no one's ever met been able to have a conversation with an unborn baby. There's just something different there. And I think that disconnect also has to do with just a decrease in care for what Scripture has to say about abortion, what Scripture has to say about unborn life. So throughout the book, we can trace how a strong scriptural understanding of life was largely what led communities like Captain Mitchell's to see abortion as murder, even though they didn't have that understanding of the anatomy of an unborn child or the science of unborn life. They knew what Scripture had to say, and that is why they prosecuted these cases as murder. Today, we see much less of that. We see, people even pressuring their girlfriends, their daughters to get abortions. And I think that's largely because even though many women today grew up with ultrasound images on their refrigerator doors, they may not have the same scriptural understanding that early Americans do. So the science doesn't matter as much if you don't have that heart behind it that understands what makes human life valuable.
Well, let's take a break, and let's, if we can, in the last half hour, focus on your sections, Still Unsettled from 1995 to 2022. Your first chapter we'll talk about after the break, Window to the Womb, and that, of course, gets us into the issue of ultrasound. And I think any of us that have ever worked with a pregnancy resource center, or in my case, spoken at various pregnancy resource center banquets, what a difference the ultrasound has made in terms of the percentage of women who, once they see their baby, change their mind. And then you have a whole section that deals with some other issues as well, including what you call the abortion industrial complex, the issue of enforcement, and a variety of other issues. It's all part of this new book, The Story of Abortion in America, A Street-Level History, 1652 to 2022. Don't forget that if you would like more information about what we're talking about, you can find it at the website pointofview.net. That's all we have for today. We look forward to seeing you next time right here on Point of View Highlights.